Now, in verse 18, the beginning, he says, slaves, submit yourselves to your masters. Now, praise God, we don't have slavery anymore. I mean, that's a wonderful thing, a great thing, all right? So, our initial reaction might be, well, this really doesn't apply to us. But now, follow the line of thinking. I mean, many commentators and scholars I read, they all make this leap. And I think it's a very reasonable leap. And that is, instead of seeing this as slaves submitting to a master, see this as an employee submitting to an employer. Even though there are obvious differences, our employers don't own us. They might think they do, but they don't, all right? But a slave works for a master, correct? And an employee works for an employer, all right? So now we have it. Okay, I'm supposed to submit to the authority not only of everybody in government, but now I'm supposed to submit to the authority of my boss, of my supervisor, the guy or the gal at work. And notice, did you pick up in verse 18, we're even supposed to submit to those who are harsh. Did you pick up on that? I don't like that one. Do you like that one? I don't like that one. So not only are we supposed to submit to the governing authorities, and the government hates us. They're even persecuting us. You got to be kidding me. And now he tells us, now you have to submit to your bosses, even if they're harsh to you. This is hard stuff. You got to be kidding me. I'm sure that they're just reeling, and they are really ticked off here. Okay? In fact, some of you are, maybe your defenses are starting to rise now. You're starting to push back. Now, come on, man. You don't know my situation at work and all this stuff. Well, this is what he says. Submit the authority. And then, in this passage here, he goes on to say, in verse 19, he says, it's actually commendable if you suffer for doing good. Okay? Meaning, again, the scenario is, as an employee, you're doing everything that your boss asks you to do. Everything. And you're doing it on time, you're meeting the deadlines, you're doing everything perfectly, but your boss still hassles you. Your boss hates you. Your boss is giving you a lot of grief. And it might be because you're a Christian, but I believe that it could also be for any other reason. I see throughout the New Testament, there's this general principle that Christians are supposed to be meek and humble, okay? We're not supposed to be rabble-rousers. And so I think this applies to a boss who's treating his or her employee in a bad way. And it could be they just got up on the wrong side of the bed. And if they're treating you unjustly, can we backtalk? No. No backtalk, no sarcasm. You're an authority figure that God has placed over me. I'm going to submit to your authority. And if you suffer, normally, if we do good, we're not going to suffer, right? I think most of us agree with that. If I do everything that the boss tells me to do, I'm not going to suffer any consequence. I'm not going to be punished. I'm not going to be suspended or fired or anything like that. But sometimes you may get grief for no reason at all. But if you do suffer, it's only commendable if you suffer for doing good. Did you get that? If you suffer for doing bad, if you suffer for doing evil, and I think in this context is, doing evil is, if your boss is treating you harshly, you cuss at him, or you say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. You rebel, you disobey, you use sarcasm. You are disrespectful. That is doing evil, that is sinning. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to submit to their authority. And if you do suffer, it only needs to be for doing good, not evil. In fact, that's how I would sum up what he says here. Suffer only for doing good, not evil. Suffer for doing good, not evil. Now again, most of the time, in most circumstances, if we do good, we do everything the government says, we do everything our boss says, we do whoever's in authority, we're doing the best we can, and we're doing well, but they still hassle us. And again, it might be because they hate Christians, okay? But it could be they just got up on the wrong side of the bed today. Maybe they're just a stinker. Doesn't matter what the reason is, I don't think. You still have to submit to the authority. And if you're going to suffer, make sure you only suffer for doing good. That means no backtalk, no sarcasm, no disobedience, nothing. And this is hard, right? And so I think Peter knows, these people, they're rebelling right now. So I'm going to have to give them an example of somebody who just did good all the time, never did anything bad, but he was punished unjustly. And let's see how he reacted when even though he did perfectly good, he was still treated unfairly, unjustly. And of course, the example is, of course, Jesus. He gives Jesus as an example that we are to follow, by the way. Beginning in verse 21, he says this, "To this you were called." Ooh. Remember, what has he just been talking about? Suffering for doing good. And then the next words he says, "To this you were called." In other words, we were called to suffer for doing good. You following the thought? Because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Now, those last couple of verses 24 and 25, those will make a great communion meditation, wouldn't they? I read them, I thought, oh man, I got to use those in a meditation. They're great communion meditation. But, even though they're theologically very significant, I think the major point here in verses 21 to 25 is to give his readers an example. Here's an example that you should follow. This backs up what I've been trying to tell you. And the example, again, is Jesus. All right? But, he begins, again, verse 21. I already noticed this, or pointed this out, but he says, "To this you were called." And he's just been talking about suffering for doing good. So what is he saying there? You, as a follower of Jesus, you have been called to potentially suffer even though you do good. You do good, but you still suffer. That's your calling. It happened to Jesus. It can happen to you. Jesus Christ gives us an example. That is the word that is used. And we can't ignore verse 21. He is our example. We are to follow in his steps. We're supposed to react to authority figures just like Jesus reacted to authority figures. He's an example to follow in his steps. And once again, if we think, well, how should we react to people in authority over us? And especially when they treat us poorly. We haven't done anything wrong, for heaven's sake. Why are you on my back, man? Leave me alone. How are we supposed to react to that? Well, Jesus is our example. And what happened to him? Well, let's see, first of all, verse 22, he committed no sin, and there was no deceit found in his mouth. He did good. He never sinned. He never backtalked. He never disobeyed. No, he didn't. As a matter of fact, verse 23 tells us specifics. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, and remember, he's only done good. He didn't do anything wrong, but he still suffered. He made no threats. And if I were to sum up, what is he saying here? Well, Christ is our example, and specifically, Christ suffered in silence. He suffered in silence. And what is his point? Christ suffered in silence. And guys, I want you to suffer in silence as well. When Jesus was insulted and beaten, and of course we know the story, he was tortured. He was actually crucified. Did he talk back? No. Any sarcasm? No. Any backtalk? No. Did he disobey? No. Did he rebel? No. Did he make threats? No. Did he take revenge? No. Nothing. He suffered in silence. And this is hard for us to take. And we, as Christians, are called to suffer in silence as well. We're supposed to submit to authority, period. Christ suffered in silence, but only suffer for doing good, right? Only suffer for doing good. We can't get out of this. Jesus is our example, and we're supposed to follow in his steps. And so, Now we come to the bottom line. And when I was working on this sermon, I just, I came up with this bottom line because I thought, that's just too in your face. I just can't say that. But every time I kept reading the passage over and over again, I thought, well, this is what he's saying. And so here's today's bottom line. Do good and keep your mouth shut. That's what he's saying there, isn't it? Do good and keep your mouth shut. That's how we should react to people in authority over us. And specifically, that's how we should react to authority figures who are treating us unfairly and unjustly. They're hassling us. They're nitpicking us. How am I supposed to react to that as a Christian? And Peter says, do good and keep your mouth shut. And, again, isn't that what Jesus did? I think it is. He committed no sin. No deceit was found in him. In other words, he just did good. Even when he was suffering, even though he was tortured and eventually crucified, did he talk back? No. Did he disobey? No. Did he call the union steward? No. He didn't do any of those things. He suffered in silence. He did good, and when they insulted him, he didn't retaliate. When they threatened him, no revenge, no backtalk, no sarcasm, no lip, no bad attitude, nothing. Jesus did good, and he kept his mouth shut. And remember, we have the same calling. Jesus is our example. I say again, this is how we should react to people in authority over us.